Good morning, good afternoon. This is Sunday, April the 2nd, and I am going to give it a few minutes to hopefully have folks join. Give it a few more minutes. Hopefully we'll have some folks join. If not, I will go ahead and share the content that I have planned for today. This morning, this is going to be the What's Your Question session. And again, I'll give it a few more minutes to see if I have some folks join. And if not, I will go ahead with the content that I have planned. All right. Good morning. I think we have a couple of folks on. I think I'll go ahead and get started on the content that I have planned for today. I'll do my intro and then I'll go ahead and get started, and hopefully we'll have a few more folks join. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your location. My name is Jewel Pearson, and this is Miss Bohemian Soul TV. This is Creating Home, a tiny house series, and this segment is the What's Your Question segment of the series. And every Sunday, I offer live content. I alternate between the What's Your Question segment that we're going to have this morning, and then the conversations on intimate spaces, where I'm talking to people in and around the tiny house movement and kind of sharing their journey. To introduce myself, I built a kind of fancy tiny house in 2015, and since that time, I have shared my journey to hopefully inspire others who are interested in the movement. I do offer coaching and consultations to help others in their tiny house journey, and you'll be able to find links to connect with me in the video description once this video goes live. And as I'm doing that, I also serve up a lot of representation in the movement along the way. I've said that I want to be able to allow us to see ourselves in this movement. And so that is what my journey here is about. Good morning. It is my intent to build figurative and literal community that is inclusive and accessible to all. And if you find this information in the video helpful, I ask that you like it, you share it, and subscribe to the channel, and then also turn on the notification so that you'll know when content is available. Good morning. Thank you for being here this morning. So again, this is the What's Your Question segment in this series. This is where I answer some of the frequently asked questions that I get, as well as share tips to help someone in or on their tiny house journey. And I also try to take an opportunity to answer questions that might come in from the chat. So this morning, the content that I have prepared to talk about is the question I'm often asked by people: how much money should I save to build a tiny house, or how much money should I have to build a tiny house? And my answer always is that it depends, and it really does depend on a lot of factors. And so I am going to, and I just realized I forgot to share my opening slide, but anyway, we'll get to it at the end. Anyway, so this content is not meant to be an all exhaustive list, but it is going to be on a higher level, the things that you need to consider as you're planning your budget for a tiny house. This is also, as I always share, this is specific to tiny houses on wheels. A tiny house on foundation is a completely different process and has different costs associated with it. So as I'm talking, most of the time I am 99.9% of the time I am talking about tiny houses on wheels, the type of house that I also have. Good morning. Thank you for being here. Also talking, and we'll be talking this morning about just the build. This is not going to talk about the cost that you'll need to consider for wherever you're going to place your tiny house, or even the infrastructure costs. This is going to be specific to a tiny house build. Also keep in mind that tiny houses do cost more per square foot than conventional homes. A lot of people are usually caught off guard when they realize that tiny houses cost more per square foot than conventional or traditional homes. But you are building a smaller house, so I won't say it balances out, but you do end up spending less money, but the cost per square footage is more than a conventional home. As we're talking about this, one of the tips that people involved in construction, as you're planning for even regular construction, people will tell you that you need to, as a rule of thumb, plan for 20 to 25% overage. Because no matter how well you try to plan and how good of a budget that you think you've outlined, you still are going to have some surprises and costs that are going to be outside of that budget. So people generally say a 20 to 25%, good morning, is what you should plan to have over that budget that you're planning for. As I'm talking about the cost to consider for your budget for a tiny house, also keep in mind that depending on if you're doing it yourself, you'll also need to factor in your budget where you're going to build a tiny house. If you're building it yourself, if you're going to have a location to build the tiny house. When I built my tiny house, I built it at a storage facility. The storage facility had an outside, it was, I think, like an old loading dock. I don't know what the building was before, but they had a loading dock. And so it was covered. And that is where I built my tiny house. And so I had to factor in to my tiny house budget the cost for rental for that location while I was there. I also had a storage unit at that facility, so that as materials came in, I could secure my materials and secure any of the tools, etc. So that was an additional cost on top of my tiny house budget. So if you are planning to build it yourself, you also want to factor that in. And if you are building it yourself, you definitely have to factor that in, because until you get the house to a point of dry in where it's wrapped and it's protected from the elements, you have to have a place where it can be built and be in stages, because if you get some bad weather, consistent rain, if it is not in that dry in stage, then you will lose everything, that the work that you've done, because the elements will undo all of your work. The elements will negatively impact the bill. So that is something important that you'll need to consider even outside of the main budget and planning for the actual tiny house. So getting into, again, the question is, how much should I plan or save to, how much money should I plan to have or to save for a tiny house build? And again, the answer I always give is that it depends. And these are some of the things I'm going to talk about. These are some of the things that you'll need to consider in your budget and in your planning. Okay, so I'll start off with the how. How are you building your house? If you're doing it yourself, DIY, one of a lot of the things that you'll need to consider for a DIY build is your level of expertise, the quality of the house, as well as your timeline. So if you're doing it yourself, you want to factor in that unless you have a background in building, you're going to probably make mistakes. It's not impossible. So many people have built their own tiny house who don't really have build experience because they've good morning, because they followed people on YouTube, they've taken classes, et cetera, et cetera. It is possible to build your own tiny house without build experience, but you also want to factor in what is your level of expertise. Are you going to make mistakes? Yes, you're going to make mistakes. And so factoring in those mistakes and the cost to redo it. So when you're planning to build it yourself, one of the things that you need to consider is money versus time. Are you going to save money by doing it yourself, and how versus how long is it going to take you to build a house? And you're going to need to consider that as far as your timeline if you have the time to do it yourself. So factoring that in. Then if you're going to build it yourself and then going to use contractors for certain parts of the bill, you'll want to factor in their services, and contractor services. Those costs are going to vary by location. Sometimes people will do partial DIY build, and then they will. Um, Good morning, glad to have you here, Key. And then they'll do half DIY, not, or maybe not half, but partial DIY and partial builder. Or it could be 100% builder, which is going to cost more because you're paying for that builder's expertise. So that is the consideration that you'll need to factor into your build. How are you building? Is it DIY, and a partial help from a builder, or 100% builder? The other thing that you'll need to factor in your budget is the when. What is your timeline? Are you meeting a deadline? Do you have to say be out of a lease by a certain, or out of a building, an apartment, a home by a certain timeline? Is that going to rush your timeline, and are you going to have to pay for expedited cost and shipping? That was something that impacted my budget. I had a hard stop to be out of my apartment by end of May. And as I was ordering materials, sometimes I'd realize that the materials weren't going to be on site in enough time. So I then had to pay for expedited shipping. Um, and so you'll need to factor that in. And I'm sorry, my nose is itching. I have been outside, and allergy pollen is out there, so my nose is itching. So apologies. Um, Also factoring in the when is your timeline is as you're planning your budget. If you're planning now for a future build, you need to recognize that cost will change from current prices. So as you're planning the cost, if you're planning a year or so in advance or a few months in advance, costs can go up and down. So that's something that you want to factor into your budget. Also for the when is factoring in the time of year. When are you planning to build? Seasons impact labor, seasons impact material cost. So for example, oftentimes contractors are busier in the warmer months. So you end up paying more for their services sometimes in the warmer months because they're in demand. In the colder months, they may be willing to cut you a deal because they're not as busy and they need the work. Seasons also impact availability of materials. So that's something that you're going to need to factor in. When are you planning to build? And that's going to impact your budget. Also, something to consider with time of year is if we think back to 2020, and the pandemic. Like no one saw that coming, but the pandemic impacted the supply chain, and so there were issues with getting materials in that impacted budget. Cost were astronomical, and that's definitely an impact to budget. Are you building during a recession when costs are also higher? So those are from a win perspective. Those are some things that you'll want to keep in mind as you're building that are going to impact your budget. And then the what. So here's the bigger piece outside of even those things that I just spoke about. Are of the things that you're going to need to consider as you're planning your budget. So your design, and that's the a big, like I said, a big piece of budgeting. What is your design? Um, Initially, are you going to design your home yourself? Are you going to work with an architect? Are you going to buy plans? And so that whatever method of design you're going to follow, you're going to need to factor that into your budget. You're going to, if you're going, I absolutely recommend that you have an architect or a structural engineer involved to kind of review the plans to ensure that your home, if you're building it yourself, that your home is stable, is built correctly, all of those things. So that's something that you'll want to factor into your budget. Also, the size of your home is going to be a major part of your budget. What are you planning for? Obviously, the larger the house, the more materials you'll need. So you want to factor that into your budget. And then also for materials, your location impacts your cost. What's available in your area? If you're planning to use, I don't want to say a specific type of, so material, wood, trees are specific to location. So if you want to use a certain type of lumber in your build that's not specific to your area, then you're going to experience additional costs for bringing that material into your area. So what's in your area? That's something that you'll want to research. That's going to impact your budget. How accessible is your area to materials? If you're in a small town and you don't have access to the big box lumber stores, that also is going to increase your pricing because you're bringing stuff into the area that is not a norm. So that's something that you'll need to factor in. Also, in your design, you'll want to consider like your materials. For example, as you all know, I have a bunch of windows in my house. Windows are expensive. Really good windows are very expensive, and you'll want to ensure that if you have a lot of windows, that you are paying good money for the long term the longevity of your house. So, what is your design? How is that going to impact your cost? You also want to make sure that you're spending money for quality lumber, your quality materials, quality, because it's always an option to go the cheaper route, but that's not going to serve you in the long run. So the investment that you make up front is going to serve you better in the long run, but that's also meaning, your budget can be higher based on that. And so you'll want to consider that as well. Um, Good morning or good afternoon, Crystal. Glad you're here. So those are that's some of the things that you'll want to consider as you're putting your budget together. I think I've gone through my list. Let me make sure I've gone through the list of everything. I've talked about contractors, subcontractors, DIYing, DIY partial or DIY 100% or working with a builder. Um, and I think one of the things that you really have to consider in putting your budget together is time equals money. So if your time involved, if your time involved in the build or your time being on site or whatever your time is involved in it, that means you're taking time away from something else. Maybe it's time away from a job, so you have to factor that into your budget, that you'll be spending time doing this, that you'd be possibly normally spending time doing something else, and you want to balance that out. So that's the list of things, the considerations. Again, when people say, how much money should I have, should I be saving for a tiny house, there's so many variables that have to be considered. What it might cost someone to build a home, a tiny house on wheels that lives in North Carolina, the cost could be 1 or 2 times that amount for someone who lives on the West Coast. And so it's not always apples to apples in considering cost. And I learned that the hard way figuring out my budget. But again, I was building I've shared that my initial budget and the cost of my house was probably about 3 times what I thought what it was going to cost. But again, I was doing this research in 2013, and there weren't a lot of tiny houses to compare to at that point. There weren't the consultations available, except it was a different time period at that time when I built my house. And as I was trying to compare the size of my house to a house that I knew someone else had built, what I didn't factor in is one of the things that I just shared. That person had built their own home, and they did all of the work in building their own home. It took them I think almost 2 years to build their house, but it was still a DIY. And I built my house. The build happened over the course of 3 months. I worked with strictly contractors. And again, I had expedited costs, as I was sharing earlier, because I had a hard deadline to be out of a space. So my build was totally different from the build of the home that I was comparing to. Plus, my design was different. All of the windows, and so all of that factored into my budget, and my budget was, like I said, 3 times what I thought my budget was going to be, because I didn't have the experience of ensuring that I was comparing all of the things, the same things to the same things, and factoring all the potential changes and challenges to a budget and so in hindsight, and as I looked at what my build cost me later on and actually was able to compare it to houses that were similar to mine, my budget was, what I paid for my house was right on point with what it should have cost. I just didn't have the knowledge up front for what that cost should have been. And so that is the benefit that people have now. There's more access to information. There's more access to people who've actually built tiny houses. There's opportunity to plug for myself. There's opportunity to have consultations with people who have done the work and have the experience in the movement that can help you with the planning process now. So it's a better time for building a tiny house, even though there's still some challenges around placement, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the awareness that all of that exists is also still something that is available to you that's beneficial. That is the information that I have. I hope that is helpful. This will be one of the resources as people ask me how much should I say for a tiny house. I oftentimes, when I say it depends, and I always try to answer a question and give a little bit of a blurb, but I sometimes feel like people think, they're in my inbox asking me that question and I say it depends. I sometimes wonder if they feel like I'm trying to just blow them off with that answer, and I'm really not, because it does actually depend. And so, and all of these factors are the things that you have to factor in. Okay, so that is the content that I had prepared for today. And I am going to see if there's some questions in the comments that I can answer. Do you get feedback from tiny house owners in other countries? Some, yes. Actually, the other week, we had Kristen Christine on, and Christine and lives in Canada. So she was the last. I think she was the last interview I did on the conversation series. So yes, I do get some feedback from other countries. And as you all know, the rules and the requirements, et cetera, are all different depending on where people live. And then outside of the United States, a small housing really isn't a unheard of concept. They're really already living small in something that is a normal consideration. But absolutely, I do hear from other people. Let's see. Here's a question. Is it difficult to salvage parts, recycling old flooring, doors, etc.? Yes, it is. And that is another thing. So thank you for bringing that up. So if you are planning to build your house from recycled materials, that is something else that you have to consider um, for a lot of reasons. One, it is the time that it's going to take to gather the materials. That is something that often takes a long time. Where are you going to store those materials? You're going to have a place to put those materials as you gather it for your build. And the time that it's going to take to gather that materials, is it going to impact the timeline for the time that you need to be building your home? Are you going to find the materials in the order that you'll need them to build the home? Um, and I said before, like, one of the things that you don't want to skimp on is your trailer. That's the foundation of your home. I always encourage people to, you'll see people who have bought salvaged trailers and felt like they were going to, I know there's a professional word, I'm just going to say refinish them, get them up to par for building on. And I think as I've watched a lot of people do that, what I think they end up saying at the end is the money and time that they spent into working with that, or getting it up to par for an actual build, they would have been better off buying a new trailer. I always encourage people not to skimp on that. Is the foundation of your home. So I always encourage people to buy a, a a new trailer just for safety measures. But then, are you going to get, the build goes in a certain process. You're building on your trailer, you're doing your subfloor, you're doing your framing. Are you going to find all of this material in the correct order so that you can have it available at the correct time for your build? Again, where are you storing all of this material? I also don't recommend skimping on your framing. Trying to use recycled lumber for your framing. The major parts of your home that are going to impact I had my word, the structural integrity of your home. You don't want to skimp on those materials and try to save money with recycled materials. So that's really important. I'm not discouraging you from using recycled materials, but you have to know the areas of the home where those materials make the most sense in using. And finding builders that are willing to use such materials. For the most part, builders are going to only want to, if they will use recycled materials, it's only going to be in more of I guess the best way to say it is aesthetics, because if they're putting their money and if they're putting their reputation and their expertise behind something, they're most likely not going to want to use recycled and salvaged parts for the integrity of the home, the main structural um, the content of the home, because that there's a potential for danger, problems, et cetera, and they don't want something to happen to the home and recognize that it was because we recycled something and we should have used new material. So most of the time, if they're going to be willing to use recycled materials, it's going to have to be more of the aesthetics, and maybe yes, flooring, but that also is going to require that you have the material available for them so that it doesn't impact the timeline for the build, so that it is kind of a very well organized orchestra of having recycled materials available, understanding what parts of the build you would want to utilize the recycled materials for, and having it available for the build at the correct time. So I hope I answered that question, and thank you for that question, because that is also important. All right, let's see. Any other questions or comments in the chat that I can address? Thank you all very much for being here this afternoon. It's a beautiful day here. All right. Crystal Judith says hello to you. All right, let me look and see if there are any other questions or comments that I can address. If not, I don't see anything else. I'm gonna give it a few minutes. I always have people in my comments and I say, this is the time, come join me on Sundays. This is when I'm answering all the questions. I am trying not to answer questions I am not answering questions in my inbox. I am encouraging people to come share space with me on Sunday when I am doing the work and giving the free stuff away. So I thank you all for being here and spending time with me on your Sunday. Let me look and see if I see anything else that I can answer. All right, it doesn't look like there's anything else. Going once. Oh, thank you, Sandra. Can you speak about registering your trailer? So I will say that is a different process for depending on the route that you're going. The way I registered my trailer, once I purchased my trailer, I went to the DMV and registered it just kind of exactly like you would a vehicle. And so that was the registration that I did for my trailer. And so with that, I got a tag for my tiny house trailer. And then with that tag, I paid DMV taxes on the trailer for my tiny house as if it is a vehicle. Um, I had insurance on the trailer as if it was a vehicle. Now I am probably at 99% sure, if through that type of insurance, if I had have a problem with my home or something happened with my home, I'm almost positive the insurance company would not have paid out the cost of my tiny house home, because they were insuring a trailer through the VIN number on the trailer. There is tiny house insurance, and I've talked about that already, and I can drop that information in the description of the video. But that is the process that I went through for registering my trailer. It really has nothing to do with the actual tiny house. It is registering the trailer so that it can move on the road. There are people who build their tiny houses and then they register their trailer and they register it something like an RV, a tiny house RV kind of deal with the VIN number. I don't have any experience in that. And as far as I know, it does not do anything from a legality perspective. So I unfortunately cannot speak to the benefits or the pros or the cons for um, doing that in that manner. Possibly in some areas it does make a difference, because as a reminder, the tiny house rules are made by location. So it's not by state, it is by city and county. So possibly in some cities, some counties, registering your tiny house with the trailer may make some type of a difference. I'm not familiar with that at all. But I just registered my trailer so that it would have a tag as I moved it on the road. I can say for sure that I even know tiny house builders who um, don't always have tags for the homes. Um, I, I'm not sure how and why, but the thought is that what most people do with registering their trailer is taking that VIN number that you'll get off of the trailer. You As you purchase it, if you purchase it yourself, you'll get the VIN number, or as you purchase your tiny house from a builder, you'll get the VIN number, and you can then register that VIN number with the DMV and register that trailer. There is no automatic recognition that it is a tiny house. It is just specific to that trailer. What other questions? So V, I see you saying something about quality, but um I don't know if you had a question. Oh, thank you, Crystal. Thank you. Have a good day. Thanks for being here. I appreciate you. Crystal was in my very first workshop that I did in DC, and so that's how we connected. And I'm gonna say that was maybe 5 years ago, Crystal. I can't remember. Uh, Sandra, are you asking another question about the trailer, or have I already answered this question? I think you've asked this twice about the trailer. Did I miss something? Absolutely. How do you address flooding, hurricanes? I've kind of talked about this before as well. I don't live in an area where I deal with flooding. Hurricanes, um, I've also said that my house can handle wind. I think I've dealt with wind up to 60, 70 miles per hour. It might have been a little bit more than that. However, if it is a hurricane, strong storms, major strong storms, I should say. I also have my house tied down. I've talked about that before. The process for tying down your house using mobile home um, materials that are specifically built to tie down a house. And if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, there's an actual video, and I'll share the link to that video in the description. If it is a major storm, I'm making plans to be somewhere else, as most people do in traditional housing. I don't have to move every time there's a windstorm, or even kind of what I would say is significant wind. My house is bigger, not bigger. It is also heavy, so it's not rocking or anything like that. As wind comes in, that for me would be a deal breaker. I would not want to feel insecure in a home that was rocking. So that's not something that happens for me. But if it is a major storm, I would leave my home. Or if it was a major storm and I had the ability, for some people, they have the ability to relocate their home. I would relocate my home. That is one of the things. And as I think about people in New Orleans that deal with flooding and hurricanes on a regular, they also have the advanced knowledge of incoming storms. And as I've had conversations with people, and we talk about tiny houses as an option for people in New Orleans, and we talked about community, because one of the reasons, one of the major reasons most people don't leave areas um, during hurricanes and storms, and when people say, well, why didn't they just leave? Finances. They don't have the money to just leave, and they don't have cars, they don't have money, which is why cities should be providing that type of assistance to people who are dealing with um, challenges of income and don't have access to finances as everyone else does. As we were talking through the opportunity for tiny houses for areas like that, we were thinking about how it would be um, nice to have those communities kind of have what you would think of, it's like an HOA, so that people were paying into on a monthly basis a fund that if a storm was coming in,